It was a quiet evening in the small town of Clearwater, Florida, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting an orange hue across the city's horizon. In the suburbs, a single house stood behind a neat garden fence. The house belonged to Officer Rachel Evans, a veteran cop with a steady career in the Clearwater Police Department. Rachel was not just a police officer. She was a mother, a daughter, and a trusted friend. But none of that could have prepared her for the night that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her own family. It was around 9 p.m. when Rachel got home from her shift. She walked into the house, her boots echoing on the tiled floor. The house was eerily quiet, except for the low hum of the air conditioner. She had expected to find her daughter, Emily, curled up in bed after a long day at school. Instead, she found the living room lights on and the door to her father's room slightly ajar. Her father, Jim, had been living with her for the past 6 months. He had recently fallen on hard times, and Rachel, being the dutiful daughter, had taken him in. Rachel stepped toward the door, and as she pushed it open, she froze. The scene before her was one she would never forget. Her father was on top of Emily, her daughter, who was crying quietly beneath him. Time seemed to stand still. The horror of the moment hit Rachel like a wave, and her heart pounded in her chest. Without thinking, she reached for the gun holstered at her side and fired. One shot, then another, and another. 5 shots. 5 shots that would change everything. Emily's sobs filled the room as Rachel lowered the gun. Her hands were trembling. She didn't know what to think, didn't know how to process what had just happened. Her father was motionless on the floor. Rachel stood there, panting, her mind racing. Was it self-defense? Was it justice? Or had she just made a terrible mistake? Rachel dropped to her knees next to Emily, her mind overwhelmed with fear and anger. She hugged her daughter tightly, trying to shield her from the horror of what had just occurred. But there was no time to think. She needed to act. She had just shot her father, and now she had to face the consequences. Rachel didn't know it yet, but this night would mark the beginning of an investigation that would unravel more than just a tragic family secret. It would expose a truth that no one could have ever predicted. The seconds felt like hours. Rachel sat on the floor, her mind a blur, cradling Emily in her arms as she whispered soothing words to her daughter. But no amount of comfort could erase the horror of what had just happened. She tried to calm her racing thoughts, but the image of her father lying dead on the floor, his blood seeping into the carpet, kept flashing in her mind. Rachel's hands were still gripping the gun tightly, almost as if it might slip from her fingers. She stared at the weapon for a moment, before placing it down gently beside her. The weight of what she had just done hit her harder than anything she had ever experienced in her life. Emily, still crying softly, clung to her mother. "Mom, what happened?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. Rachel's heart shattered for her daughter. How could she explain this? How could she even begin to make sense of what had just transpired? She didn't know what to say, so instead she simply held Emily tighter. The phone on the kitchen counter began to ring. It cut through the silence like a sharp knife, making Rachel jump. The instinct to flee, to hide from what she had done, surged through her. But she knew that wouldn't solve anything. She had to act. She was a police officer. She had been trained to handle situations like this. With a deep breath, she stood up and went to the kitchen, wiping her hands on her jeans as if she could wipe away the guilt that already felt too heavy to bear. She picked up the phone. Rachel, the voice on the other end, was her partner, Officer Dan Harris. Rachel's mind raced. She couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. Not now. "Hey, Dan," she replied, trying to steady her voice. I I need help. Something's happened. My dad, he's been shot. I need backup." Dan's voice was immediately filled with concern. "What do you mean? Was it an accident?" Rachel's mind whirled. The lie came naturally, like it was rehearsed. "Yeah, it was an accident. He he was just cleaning his gun, and it went off. I need someone here. Please." Dan hesitated, then said, "Okay, stay put. I'm sending backup your way. Don't touch anything until we get there, Rachel." "Okay, thanks, Dan," Rachel muttered, her voice weak. She hung up before he could say anything else. Mother, moment the phone call ended, Rachel felt a wave of panic wash over her. She had just lied to her partner, to her friend. The lie felt like a weight she couldn't escape. But the reality of the situation was too terrifying to face. She needed time. She needed to think. But what would happen when the backup arrived? How would she explain the scene? Would they see the truth in her eyes? Would they be able to tell that something was off? Her eyes flicked toward Emily, who was still curled up on the couch, her face streaked with tears. Rachel knew she couldn't afford to let her daughter slip through her fingers in all of this. The truth could destroy her, too. She glanced at the door. The backup would be here soon, and there was no turning back. Rachel felt her heart beat faster. There were many more lies to tell, many more decisions to make, and each one would come with a price. Rachel's hands were shaking as she walked back into the living room. She found Emily sitting quietly on the couch, her face pale from shock, eyes wide and uncertain. Rachel had always prided herself on being able to keep calm in a crisis, but tonight she felt like a stranger to herself. She had done something terrible, and now the reality of the consequences began to creep in like an unwelcome shadow. Minutes seemed to stretch on forever. The sound of sirens in the distance made Rachel's heart race. She knew they were getting closer, her colleagues, the first responders, and with them, the weight of the investigation that would follow. She walked to the front door and opened it, stepping outside to meet the arrival of the patrol cars. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched the flashing lights illuminate the street, casting a surreal glow across the yard. She felt like she was in a dream, watching everything unfold from the outside. Dan's car was the first to pull up. He got out quickly, his face creased with concern as he walked up to her. His usual easygoing demeanor was gone, replaced by a sense of urgency. He was in full uniform, his gun holstered at his side. "Rachel, what's going on?" Dan asked, his voice low. "Is everyone okay?" Rachel swallowed hard, struggling to form the words. Her mind raced with thoughts of the lie she had just told him. Could she keep it up? Could she keep up the facade of an innocent accident? Her gut told her that the truth was far more complicated. Rachel began, but her voice faltered. "I don't know, Dan. I just found him like this. My dad, he was shot." Dan's brow furrowed. "Where's Emily?" "She's inside," Rachel replied, her voice wavering. She's in shock." Dan nodded. "Stay here. I'll talk to her." "Stay calm, Rachel." Rachel watched him go inside. She felt a sense of guilt wash over her, a deep pit forming in her stomach. She knew this would not be over quickly. She had just told Dan an elaborate lie, and soon the truth would be exposed. But right now she couldn't afford to fall apart. Not yet. Not when everything was on the line. Within minutes, more officers and a paramedic team arrived at the house. They were methodical, focused, and trained to assess the situation without bias. But Rachel could feel the weight of their eyes on her as they moved around the house, checking the crime scene and asking questions. One officer, Sergeant Linda Evans, no relation, entered the house and immediately started questioning Rachel. The room was filled with the hum of radio static and the low murmur of officers speaking in hushed tones. Sergeant Evans, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for getting to the truth, focused intently on Rachel as she explained what had happened. "Rachel," she began, her voice calm but stern, "can you walk me through what happened? From the beginning?" Rachel nodded, trying to steady her breathing. "I came home from work, and when I walked in, I found my father in his room. He was lying there with the gun next to him. I didn't know what to do. I called Dan, and then I just told him that it was an accident." Sergeant Evans narrowed her eyes. "An accident? Was your father handling the weapon?" Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I didn't see him, but I think he was cleaning it. He was always cleaning his guns." Sergeant Evans didn't seem convinced. "Rachel, it's going to be important for you to be absolutely clear on what happened. We need to get this right." Rachel's stomach twisted. The truth was slipping away from her, faster than she could hold on to it. She felt herself retreat into the lie, the words spilling out without her fully thinking. "We were in shock, Sergeant," Rachel said, her voice shaky. "I didn't know what to do." I was just so scared. Sergeant Evans studied her for a moment before nodding. Okay, we'll need to take a statement from Emily as well. She's your daughter, right? Yes, Rachel replied, her heart sinking. She's in her room. She doesn't know much. I don't think she saw anything. Sergeant Evans looked around the room, her gaze lingering on the lifeless body of Rachel's father, Jim. She turned back to Rachel. Stay here for now. We'll take care of everything. Rachel watched as Sergeant Evans and the other officers continued to process the scene. It was happening. The investigation was already underway, and Rachel's lie would soon be tested. As the minutes passed, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Sergeant Evans wasn't buying the story, but she was too experienced to show her hand just yet. Rachel's mind raced with thoughts of how to maintain her innocence. Would they believe her? Would they find out what really happened in that room? The questions kept circling, but one thing was certain. The investigation had only just begun, and Rachel's world was about to come crashing down. The hours dragged on as Rachel sat in the sterile, fluorescent-lit living room, trying to gather herself. Officers were in and out of the house, collecting evidence, taking photos and making notes. The air felt thick with tension, as though everyone was aware that this was no ordinary case. This was personal. For Rachel, it was more than a crime scene. It was her family. Sergeant Linda Evans had spent the last half hour speaking with Emily in a separate room. Rachel hadn't been allowed to be with her daughter during the questioning, and that alone sent a wave of panic through her. Emily had already seen too much, heard too much. The last thing Rachel wanted was for her daughter to be caught in a web of lies she couldn't escape. Rachel stood up abruptly, the pressure mounting on her chest. She needed to see Emily. She had to make sure her daughter was okay. But before she could make a move, Sergeant Evans appeared in the doorway. Rachel, she said, her voice soft but firm. I need to talk to you. Rachel nodded, her heart beating faster. She could sense that things were shifting. The veteran investigator's demeanor had changed since she first arrived at the scene. It wasn't just about the shooting anymore. There were layers, unspoken questions that Rachel didn't know how to answer. Evans motioned for Rachel to follow her to the kitchen, away from the rest of the officers. I just spoke with Emily, she said, her eyes studying Rachel closely. She's not doing well. She's terrified, but she's being very cooperative. She told me something. Something that doesn't add up with your story. Rachel's throat went dry. The lies she had told seemed to unravel before her eyes. She tried to keep her voice steady, but it wavered. What do you mean? Evans looked at her for a moment before speaking. Emily says she saw you shoot Jim. She says you shot him 5 times. Rachel's stomach churned, and for a moment she couldn't speak. The lie she had carefully crafted, the one she had convinced herself was the truth, was now disintegrating. Emily had seen everything. No, Rachel whispered, shaking her head. She's confused. She must be. She's been through so much tonight. Evans raised a hand, cutting her off gently. Rachel, I know you're under a lot of stress, but you need to tell me the truth. I'm not here to accuse you. I'm here to understand what happened. Rachel felt as though the walls were closing in on her. The reality of her situation had never been clearer. She had just shot her father, but why? What had driven her to such an extreme? Was it truly self-defense? Or was it something darker? I don't know what you're talking about, Rachel said, but the words felt empty even as she spoke them. I told you it was an accident. He was cleaning his gun, and it just went off. I didn't. Rachel, Evans interrupted, her tone softer now. We're not accusing you of anything, but your story doesn't match the physical evidence. Jim was found lying face up. The shots were all to the front of his body, his chest, his abdomen, and his face. No one cleans a gun like that. No one accidentally shoots themselves 5 times in those places. Rachel's breath hitched. The evidence was piling up against her. She couldn't explain away the gunshot wounds, not when they were so precise, not when they told a different story than the one she had told. Evans continued, You've been through something terrible tonight, and I understand that. But you need to be honest with me, Rachel. What really happened? The words caught in Rachel's throat, a lump forming that she couldn't swallow down. Her thoughts flashed back to the moment she walked in and saw her father with Emily. The image was seared into her mind. She had been paralyzed by shock, then consumed with rage. The rage that had built up over the years, the secrets she had known but never said aloud. I, I walked in and saw him with Emily, Rachel said, her voice trembling. I didn't know what to think. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to do. Evans didn't say anything, but her silence spoke volumes. Rachel continued, almost as if she couldn't stop herself now. He, he was touching her. I don't know if it was intentional or if it was something else, but I couldn't let him hurt her. I couldn't let him destroy everything. Her words tumbled out in a desperate rush. I pulled my gun. I didn't think. I just shot him. For a moment, Rachel was still, as if the weight of her confession had shattered her. She had said it out loud. She had admitted it. Evans looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and professionalism. Rachel, I know this is hard, but you need to understand what happens next. The truth is out now. We'll make sure Emily's taken care of, and we'll look at all of the circumstances. But you're going to need legal counsel, and you're going to have to face the consequences of your actions. Rachel nodded, the reality of her words sinking in. Her mind was spinning, and for the first time in hours, she allowed herself to cry. She had shot her father, but the truth, the full truth, was even darker than she had imagined. As Sergeant Evans turned to leave, she paused at the door. I'll make sure you get the help you need, Rachel. We'll take care of Emily. But now it's time for the system to do its job. Rachel sank into a chair, her body feeling hollow. The investigation was no longer about an accident. It was about justice, about truth, and about the consequences of what she had done. The cold steel of the handcuffs was the only thing that felt real as they clicked shut around Rachel's wrists. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the tears she had held back for so long now streamed freely down her face. The officers moved quickly, efficiently. They'd seen it all before. The grief, the confusion, the guilt. But nothing about this case felt ordinary. Rachel Evans, a well-respected officer in Clearwater, had just shot her own father. She sat in the back of the patrol car, the weight of the metal seats pressing against her body, her thoughts a jumble of disbelief and horror. It felt like she was floating above her own life, watching everything unfold like a bad dream she couldn't wake from. She kept asking herself over and over, how had it come to this? How had the strong, dependable woman who protected her community become someone capable of taking a life? As the car rolled through the streets of Clearwater, Rachel glanced out the window at the city she had called home for years. It was so quiet, almost as if the world was holding its breath. And yet, inside her, everything was in chaos. Rachel hadn't expected to be arrested, at least not this quickly. She thought they would give her time to grieve, to explain, to convince them that she had acted out of a desperate need to protect Emily. But that wasn't the reality. Sergeant Evans had been right. The evidence spoke for itself, and Rachel knew that no matter how many times she said it was an accident, the facts would remain unchanged. She had shot her father 5 times. There was no accident in that. She thought about Emily, who had been so scared and confused during the questioning. What would happen to her now? What would she say when people asked her about her mother? The thought of her daughter facing the world without her mother, without the protection of the person who was supposed to keep her safe, tore at Rachel's heart. The patrol car came to a stop outside the local precinct. The officers helped Rachel out of the car, guiding her into the building. She tried to steady her breath, but the weight of the moment crushed her chest. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but deep down, she knew this was the beginning of something she couldn't undo. Inside the precinct, the bright lights were harsh and unwelcoming. It felt like the whole world was watching her, her colleagues, people who had trusted her, people who had admired her. Now they were the ones who would have to carry out the investigation. They were the ones who would decide whether she would go to prison for the rest of her life. As she was led into an interrogation room, Rachel took a seat at the metal table. Her hands shook, and she instinctively pulled them into her lap, trying to stop the tremors. The door opened, and Sergeant Evans walked in, her face set in a determined expression. She closed the door behind her, and for a moment, the room was silent. I know this is hard, Rachel, Evans began, her voice measured but not unkind. But you need to help us understand what happened. You've told us your side of the story, but I think there's more to it. We need to get to the truth. Rachel didn't speak for a moment. staring at her hands. Her mind kept returning to that moment, the moment she walked into the room and saw her father with Emily. The flash of fury, the overwhelming need to protect, the desperation to stop what she thought was about to happen. But it wasn't just that. There was something darker, something deeper, something Rachel had buried for years, something she hadn't wanted to face. I, Rachel's voice cracked as she spoke. I, I don't know if I can explain. I don't know how to make you understand. She paused, her gaze drifting to the floor. But I didn't just shoot him because of what I saw with Emily. There was more to it, more than I realized. Evans didn't interrupt. She just waited, her eyes softening. She knew this was a pivotal moment in the investigation. If Rachel was finally ready to face the truth, the investigation would take on a new direction. Rachel closed her eyes, feeling the sting of regret. I've been carrying so much for so long, she whispered. My father, he wasn't a good man. He never was. When I was younger, when I was a teenager, he did things to me, things I couldn't talk about, things I couldn't tell anyone. I thought I had buried it all, but when I saw him with Emily, I couldn't let him do it again. I couldn't let him destroy her the way he destroyed me. The room felt colder as the words left her lips. Evans said nothing, but Rachel could feel the weight of her gaze, steady and unwavering. For the first time, Rachel spoke the truth, the full, horrifying truth of what had been done to her by the man she had once called her father. I was so afraid, Rachel continued, her voice faltering. I thought I could stop it before it happened, but I never should have done what I did. I couldn't think. I just shot him, and now he's dead, and I've ruined everything. Evans let the silence stretch for a moment. She took a seat across from Rachel, her expression thoughtful but calm. Rachel, she said quietly, you've just admitted to something very serious. But I need you to understand. What happened tonight, it wasn't just about what your father did. It was about your response, your actions. I'm not here to judge you, Rachel, but I need you to understand that we're going to do our jobs, and that means we need to look at every aspect of this. No one is above the law. Rachel nodded, the weight of the words sinking in. She had crossed a line that couldn't be erased, and now she had to face the consequences. She wasn't just a police officer anymore. She was a woman who had broken the law, and there was no turning back from that. As Evans stood to leave, she paused at the door. You're going to need a lawyer, Rachel. It's time to face what comes next. Rachel looked down at her hands, knowing that her life had just changed forever. The consequences of her actions were clear, and no matter what happened next, she would have to live with them. The days that followed were a blur of court hearings, lawyers, and media attention. Rachel sat in the cramped holding cell, her mind spinning with thoughts she couldn't control. The initial shock of her arrest had worn off, but it was quickly replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. She had confessed, admitted to killing her father in cold blood, even if her reasons were born of desperation and a lifetime of trauma. Now she would face the consequences. Her attorney, a seasoned public defender named Karen Caldwell, had been with her every step of the way. Karen was blunt, pragmatic, and driven. She hadn't sugarcoated anything. Rachel, she had said in their first meeting, we're not here to make you a saint. We're here to ensure that you get the best deal possible given the circumstances. But even with Karen's reassurance, Rachel couldn't shake the overwhelming guilt that weighed her down. She had taken a life. Even though the details of her father's abuse were buried deep within her, they weren't enough to erase the fact that her actions had irreversibly altered the lives of everyone involved. Her mother, once a beacon of strength in her life, had distanced herself. Rachel hadn't spoken to her since the arrest, and every time she thought of her, a sharp pang of regret gnawed at her. She knew her mother was grieving for Jim, for the family she thought she knew, for the daughter she could no longer trust. But what hurt the most was the silence, the cold, unrelenting silence. And then there was Emily. Her daughter had been the one thing Rachel was determined to protect. But now Emily was caught in the middle of a nightmare. Rachel had no idea how to make things right, or if she ever could. Emily had been traumatized by everything she'd witnessed that night, and though she had been placed in the custody of her aunt, Rachel's estranged sister, there was no guarantee that Emily would ever forgive her mother. No guarantee that she would ever feel safe again. Rachel's thoughts were interrupted by the heavy door of her cell opening. A guard stepped inside, his expression unreadable. Visitation, the guard said simply. Rachel stood up, her heart rate quickening. Was it Emily? Or her mother? Maybe it was. Sergeant Evans coming to speak to her again. With her mind racing, Rachel followed the guard down the narrow hallway to the visitation room. Her hands were trembling as she entered the small, sterile space. A single figure sat at the table, their back to her. Rachel's pulse surged as she took a step closer, but the figure turned around before she could say a word. It was Emily. Rachel froze, unable to speak for a moment. She had expected so many things. Her mother's face full of judgment. Maybe even a public defender with more bad news. But not Emily. Not her daughter. "Mom," Emily said softly, her voice fragile. "I don't know if I should be here." Rachel swallowed hard. The sight of her daughter broke her heart. Emily was so young, so vulnerable, and yet she carried the weight of something no child should ever have to carry. Rachel couldn't help but wonder how much of that night her daughter would remember. Would she remember the shock, the terror, the sound of her grandfather's body hitting the floor? Or would the memory fade with time, leaving only the emptiness Rachel felt now? "Sweetheart," Rachel said hoarsely, trying to steady her voice. "You don't have to be here if you don't want to. I just—" Emily cut her off. "I came because I need to know why," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "Why did you do it, Mom? Why did you shoot Grandpa? I... I don't understand." Rachel's breath caught in her throat, the question hanging in the air like a heavy weight. Emily needed an answer, but the answer Rachel had was complicated, messy, and painful. How could she explain everything? The abuse, the years of fear, the rage that had consumed her when she walked into that room. How could she make Emily understand? "I didn't want to hurt him, Emily," Rachel began, her voice trembling. "I didn't. But when I saw him with you, I couldn't think straight. I thought he was going to hurt you, and I didn't know what else to do." Emily's face twisted with confusion. "But Mom, you shot him 5 times. You said you wanted to protect me, but how could that protect me? How could killing him protect me?" Rachel's heart shattered as she listened to her daughter's words. Emily was right. She had reacted out of a deep, primal fear, but in doing so, she had only made things worse. In her attempt to protect Emily, she had shattered their lives forever. "I know," Rachel whispered. "I know, and I'm so sorry. I should have never done it. I should have thought. I should have—" "You didn't protect me, Mom," Emily interrupted, her voice breaking. You hurt everything. You hurt me, and you hurt yourself." Rachel closed her eyes, trying to block out the pain of her daughter's words. She had always prided herself on being a protector, someone who could do no wrong in the eyes of her child. But now, in this small, sterile room, everything had crumbled. She wasn't the protector anymore. She was the one who had caused the destruction. "I'm sorry," Rachel repeated, the words feeling empty against the weight of everything she had done. Emily stood up slowly, her face tear-streaked but determined. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this, Mom," she said quietly. "But I want to believe you. I want to believe you didn't mean it. I want to believe you didn't want to hurt anyone." Rachel nodded, knowing that forgiveness might never come. But at least her daughter was speaking to her. At least Emily still cared enough to try and understand. That was the small sliver of hope Rachel clung to as her world fell apart around her. Emily turned toward the door, but before she left, she paused and looked back one last time. "I'll visit again, okay? But I need time. I need time." Rachel didn't say anything. She couldn't. She could only watch as her daughter walked out of the room, leaving her to face the long, lonely road ahead. As the door clicked shut behind her, Rachel sank back into her seat, staring at the empty space where Emily had just been. The walls of the visitation room felt smaller now, the air thinner. She had no idea what the future held, but one thing was clear. She had no way of undoing what had been done, and she was going to have to face the consequences of that, one step at a time. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next with a suffocating monotony. Rachel sat in her cell, surrounded by the echoes of her own thoughts. The weight of the situation was too much for her to bear. The investigation had slowed down, but it hadn't stopped. She knew the police were still working tirelessly to piece together the truth of that fateful night, and she could only hope that in time, they would uncover the full story. Her trial was approaching, and Rachel's legal team was preparing for what would be a complicated case. The murder charge loomed over her like a dark cloud, but Rachel had learned to accept the possibility that she would never be free again. But that didn't mean she wasn't going to fight for the truth to come to light. It wasn't just about what she had done. It was about everything that had led to that moment. The years of silence, of pretending that everything was fine, even when it wasn't. The trauma she had suffered at the hands of the man she had once called her father. She knew that if she didn't speak out now, the truth might never be known. She wasn't just fighting for her life, she was fighting for Emily's future, for the understanding that her daughter deserved. It was on the morning of the trial that Rachel received an unexpected visitor. Sergeant Evans. "How are you holding up, Rachel?" Evans asked, her voice as steady as ever. Despite the circumstances, Rachel could tell that Evans was genuinely concerned. The investigator had been diligent in following up on every lead, every shred of evidence, even the ones that were uncomfortable to confront. "I've had better days," Rachel replied, her voice tired. "I don't know how I'm supposed to make sense of all of this." Evans nodded, sitting down opposite her. "I understand, but I think we've uncovered something important, something that could change everything." Rachel sat up straighter, her interest piqued. "What do you mean?" "We've been looking at your father's history," Evans began, "and not just what happened that night. We've gone back through old records, spoke to a few people who knew him when you were a child." Rachel's heart began to race. She had spent years burying the memories, avoiding anything that might bring the past into the light. The thought of it being exposed was terrifying, but she had to know. She had to face it all, even if it meant facing the darkness that had followed her for so long. "Do you remember when you were about 14 years old?" Evans continued, her tone careful. "There was a police report from a domestic disturbance at your home. Your father was involved, but it was marked as a misunderstanding. There was no follow-up, no investigation. It was dismissed." Rachel's eyes widened. She had heard of the incident, but her mind had pushed it away as just another unfortunate event in a long string of them. Her father's temper was well known, but so was the family's attempt to cover it up, to make everything seem like it wasn't as bad as it actually was. I, I remember," Rachel said softly. "It was one of many things I've tried to forget. My mother always protected him. She didn't want anyone to know what he was really like." Evans leaned forward. "Rachel, we found something else, something I think you need to hear. Your father's previous wife, before he married your mother, came forward. She's been living out of state for years, but when we contacted her, she said something that fits with what you've told us about him. She said he was abusive, and she even mentioned that he had a history of molesting children, his own, in fact." Rachel felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under her. The words hit her like a tidal wave, washing away the last remnants of the protective shell she had built around herself. Her father had done the unthinkable, more than she had ever imagined. She had known on some level that he was a monster, but hearing it from someone else, the undeniable truth of it, was too much to bear. "She said that he abused her daughter too," Evans continued, her voice low, "the same way he did to you. And she told us that your father had been on probation for similar offenses before you were born, but they were never brought to light. It seems that he had a long history of this." Rachel's stomach churned. The realization hit her like a sledgehammer. She had spent years thinking she was the only one, the only victim of her father's horrors. But she wasn't, and that meant everything had been a lie. Everything she had been told about family, about safety, about the man she had trusted. "Rachel, your father's actions that night, what he did with Emily, weren't just isolated. He was continuing a pattern, and you saw it. You didn't just act out of fear. You acted out of a lifetime of knowing what he was capable of, what he had done. You protected your daughter in the only way you thought possible." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. The weight of Evan's words sank into her chest, and she finally understood why she had reacted the way she did. She had seen the monster for who he was, and she had tried to stop him. She couldn't stop the violence from infecting her own family. She couldn't stop him from coming back into her life, over and over again, and trying to destroy everything she loved. But what happened that night was still wrong, Evans continued, her voice gentle. The law doesn't justify murder, no matter the reasons. But your story, your father's story, needs to be told. And it will be. We're going to make sure the court understands everything. Rachel nodded slowly, her heart heavy with the realization that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. She had been a victim for so long, and now she had become a defendant, caught in the crossfire of a broken system that hadn't protected her or Emily. But at least there was hope. At least the truth was coming to light. As Evan stood to leave, Rachel's thoughts turned to Emily. The weight of the responsibility she had to her daughter now seemed heavier than ever. The road ahead was long, but Rachel was finally ready to face it. She was ready to fight for herself, for her daughter, and for the truth. When Evans reached the door, she paused and turned back to Rachel. One more thing, she said. You're not alone in this. You never have been. And with that, she left the room, leaving Rachel to face whatever would come next.